Fortunately, the Beatles are in a position to buy expensive liniment. The makeup artist on the film was Mr. John O'Gorman.
Well, of course, the terrible difficulty is rather like doing a make-up with a terrible hangover on someone who also had a hangover. And with trying to get in with the rhythm of the train, plus the usual joking of the boys in the background, I think it got done by miracle every day.
And what the hairdresser cut from the heads of her clients might have been transformed into pure gold.
I had lots of letters from all over the world asking for pieces of hair. If I'd answered them all, the Beatles would probably have been bald by now.
This is one of the professional actors who agreed to take part in this film, running the risk, of course, of being totally overlooked. However, if anyone is to escape that fate, I dare say it's Wilfrid Bramble. Gilbert Taylor was the cameraman on the film. He said,
"We took off with 4 little lamps called colour trams, called sun guns, I should say, and with a lot of throat microphones, knowing full well we couldn't take the roof off the train or take one of the walls out, and that we'd have the sun coming in 1 minute and out the next. We'd be going through tunnels, under bridges and cuttings."
And now Wilfrid Bramble, the experienced professional, speaks for himself.
They brought me into their generation without my asking. I stepped back and thought, they're young enough to be my grandsons. I was cast as Paul's grandfather, and before the film started, Joan said, "Your part is Paul's grandfather, so stop pretending you're not old enough to be it."
The director liked the newsreel, the documentary style of filming. It looks a bit awkward here, not the sort of space you'd get if you mocked up the whole thing in a studio. But Lester thought that filming in the real place, however unhandy, might turn out to have its uses.
We didn't want to hire a studio, rent that old train that moves from studio to studio, pushed by 4 people, 1 on each corner, with either revolving drums or back projection flashing by. And we thought, no matter what happened, we should shoot it on a train, because there is a certain quality which happens when you're forced to accept the limitations of not having a tripod, not having the proper lighting, not having the proper sound. So we got a train.
Isn't it curious that fans never seem to resent the apartness of their idols? They wait and wait in surroundings of the utmost privation and seem delighted to do so. They show only eagerness, never impatience. They have a peculiarly hungry yet trustful look, as though they know someone will eventually feed them.
The first time I ever heard the Beatles was on Housewife's Choice, and then I met them in a sound radio show, and they were utterly charming, and they asked me for my autograph, and don't tell them that I wasn't quite sure who they were. It was moments later that I thought, oh, Lord, it's the Beatles.
I shouldn't think that any of the boys singly would want to be considered a film star. They may later, but I don't think they have to or want to be or need to now. They are film personalities, certainly, without any question.
Alexander Walker's a journalist who went to watch the film while it was being made. He was going to do a blow-by-blow account of what went on for his paper.
It was astonishing to see how many people identified with the Beatles. At one little halt in the West Country, a clergyman suddenly whipped a Beatles wig out of his overcoat pocket and jammed it on his head.
The waters of enthusiasm never ebbed. This middle-aged lady was present every day for a week. Everyone else was being paid, but she just liked being there. Norman Rossington, the Beatles' manager in the film, says,
We used to stop every day at Somerset, actually. And, of course, they'd all crowd round the windows and belt on the windows and scream and shout, "We love you, love you." And one day Ringo got up, instead of belting on the windows where the fans were, he went over to the other side of the coach, started hammering on the windows there to another empty coach, shouting, "Cliff, Cliff, Cliff!"
Ringo is the saddest, but I think he turned out to be the best actor in the film, the most convincing, the most real.
Oh, with the Beatles, one never knows whether you're being sent up or taken for serious. They're marvellous.
When you come to think about it, it must have been rather trying to be followed round by a second camera, I mean this one, while you were having all your work cut out to act for the first one.
When we actually started shooting, they, of course, all reacted reasonably differently. For instance, Paul was the most self-conscious of all the four. For what reason, I don't know, of course. Maybe he's shyer than the rest, I don't know. But whenever he had a close-up to do, especially at the beginning, until he got used to the technique, you could see that he was a little troubled and withdrawn about it, but even he did master it after a time. John, on the other hand, just shouted everything and fooled about generally and pulled lots of funny faces and made up funny lines. George and Ringo just sailed through it quite unconsciously. They seemed to take to the technique, or they weren't aware of the technique, let's say. I think that's probably why they all came out so well finally, was that no acting technique as such got into the way.
Owen, the man who wrote the lines for them, followed the Beatles round for weeks to get the hang of the way they spoke. It was the only way of doing it because no one wanted them to play anything but themselves. Owen comes from Liverpool himself and knows as well as the Beatles do that a jambutti isn't at all the same thing as a plate of blind scouse.
George has a certain way of talking which I elaborated in a way. I stylized it so that I got George saying lines like, "I'm quite prepared for that eventuality," which maybe he wouldn't say in real life, but it went with the scan, as it were, of his own voice, and certain the sort of zaniness of John. All one had to do in a way was follow that line through and encourage it and add to it. And the same, and with Ringo, I went in a completely different way. I gave him lines to say in the film like, "That's right, hide behind a smokescreen of bourgeois cliches," or "I know the psychological pattern and it plays hell with me drumskins."
Well, after all this talk and all